In this RIP broadcast, I talked to Paul Snowdon, former Grote Professor of the UCL Philosophy Department. We discuss his philosophical upbringing, the deification of Peter Strawson, and the clear and pressing need for common sense in philosophical discourse.
My interest in philosophy really came from thinking really about the existence of God, because I was brought up in a household where my father was a vicar, and so we attended church, and I was brought up believing in God.
Right.
But in my teens, this was the major question I faced: does God really exist? Okay. And I thought very hard about that, and read books on what we call philosophical theology in an effort to work out the answer. And my own thinking was that none of the standard metaphysical arguments for God's existence are sound or convincing.
Right.
Okay. But what puzzled me was how you could have what might be called moral value without God. Because what's the source of moral value?
Yeah.
And so that was the problem that I was facing. And I had the incredible good luck to read the moral philosophy of R.M. Hare. Language of Morals and Freedom and Reason were the two books he'd brought out at that stage. And as I read them, I became convinced that Hare was right.
Right.
Okay. And that he'd, in a sense, propounded an account of the nature of moral thinking, which was completely naturalistic in one sense, and enabled moral discourse to continue and have validity, even if God doesn't exist. The thing was that, Hare was a wonderful writer and thinker, but somehow or other I got from him the impression that Oxford was the centre of philosophy.
Right.
And that at the centre of that centre was Strawson.
Peter Strawson.
Yeah, Peter Strawson.
Yeah.
Yes, not Galen, no. Peter. And so, in a way which I can't now understand, I decided I would apply to do philosophy at University College, Oxford,
Right.
where Strawson was.
So when was this? This was
1965.
1965,
Yeah.
right. And so you turned up to Oxford,
Yes.
and Strawson was there,
Yes.
and
Very shortly, Mackie turned up at UNIV.
right.
And shortly after him, MacDowell as well. It was a wonderful place, a wonderful college to be in, but also in Oxford there were incredible galaxy of very, very powerful philosophers. And it was a wonderful time to learn the subject, actually.
So you must have, a number of the people there must have been kind of philosophical inspirations for you throughout your career, is that?
Well, the three I've already mentioned were, amongst my own tutors, there was also Michael Woods, who was at Brasenose College, but who taught me, and was a very deep, very clever philosopher, who acted as an inspiration. Within the institution as a whole, you had, at that stage, you had Ryle, you had Eyre, you had a kind of a youngish Dummett, and you had Philippa Foot,
Yes.
and you had Anscombe,
Yeah. Yeah.
who was there when I arrived as well.
You said that you went to lectures, Wittgenstein lectures
I
that
did,
she gave.
by
yeah.
Anscombe, yes. And they were very gripping,
It's,
although I didn't fully understand them
right.
at the beginning. I think the person who influenced me most really was Strawson,
Right.
because I can convey in a sense, the impression he had on people, certainly on me. When I say that the kind of description that was given of a tutorial with Strawson was an interview with God. You really felt, as you went out the stairs and knocked on his door, you were about to speak to the deity.
Wow.
Because his complete control of the subject
Yeah.
and the issues was just so impressive. And also, his ability to convey to you and teach you and guide you
Yes.
was unsurpassed, actually.
Yeah.
So he's an inspiration both as a philosopher, to me, and always has been, and an inspiration as a tutor, teacher.
So you mentioned Michael Woods as
Yes.
well. Was he one of those people who was incredibly engaged in the scene but didn't produce
Yes, he was.
that much material?
And he was, partly because he was one of these people who might be called a college man.
Right.
So he had roles in Brasenose College, which is where he was, and he was very committed to it as a college, as an institution, and would take on roles, whereas, and wasn't single-mindedly pursuing a publishing career. He didn't
Right.
publish a lot. That's why he's not as well known.
So in terms of the kind of careers that you can have now in philosophy, it doesn't seem tenable given the
No.
REF and things like that.
No, indeed. I mean, he could have published masses because the work he wrote and read around Oxford was very high quality. But it didn't seem to him that he had to publish it.
It's amazing to think about somebody being able to pursue that kind of philosophical career, especially when we think about philosophy as it's practiced now
Yes.
and the pressures that academics
Yes.
get from the REF and things like that.
Yes.
And it sounds amazing, both as it's good for him, but it's also very good for the students to have somebody
Yes.
who is investing the time and effort into
That was true.
the collegial atmosphere.
That was
Yeah.
true. You couldn't quite have a career like that now.
No. I mean, are there things that strike you as being particular problems for philosophy as it appears in the UK and in the US at the moment?
Going back to the REF type of thing,
Sure.
I mean, in my lifetime, this sort of thing has been introduced. It wasn't there when I started
Right.
as an academic.
Yeah.
And I think it's a kind of a two-sided weapon. It doesn't seem to me to be wrong to have some kind of system of assessing, might be called research output, within British universities.
Right.
When I started, there was perhaps inadequate attention paid to that,
Right.
and inadequate attention paid to how individual careers were going. There were no systems really of appraisal, except in very, very vague and general terms.
Right.
And there was no one coming in from outside and thinking that the research in a certain department is good or bad. And those kinds of processes, appraisal and research assessments, aren't per se bad, it seems to me. On the other hand, there's no doubt that a consequence of it, as it happens, is one, there's a tendency to concentrate on research as opposed to teaching, and so that the education that people get nowadays as students in British universities has maybe suffered as compared with how it was in the 1960s and early 1970s. And secondly, because these assessments are so important, the amount of time that doing them involves
Yeah.
takes people away from what they should be doing
All the
anyway.
administrative matters kind
It
of
does.
sap your
It
energy.
does. But I don't know myself quite how to solve this, because I don't think you can say, oh, it's a complete waste of time,
Yeah.
because some sort of appraisal system and a research assessment is defensible. Okay, so I can't suggest a solution to this problem. The major weakness of the subject, but you've got to tell me whether you think this is fair, Adam, is the weakness that it has always had as a subject, which is that philosophers are prone to adopt conclusions on the basis of inadequate support. And that this has the consequence that quite a number of philosophers, if I can put it this way, have lost any sense of reality
Right.
in what they say. And you can have some sort of extreme illustrations of this. One would be the popularity of panpsychism
Right.
as a theory of the mind, in which, according to some people, they can just prove that subatomic particles have minds or are mentally endowed.
Well, it makes sense. Yeah.
And then they face the question is, how come? And that's what they worry about.
Yeah.
And you think, well, how can you possibly get into that view in the first place? Or again, there's a popularity still for dualism, and the idea that basically there has to be, mental states have to have a nature which is non-material, and it's very difficult to see what basis there is, aside from a few metaphysical intuitions that philosophers bring with them, for saying that. Why do philosophers say that? But you can see it in all sorts of standard philosophical discussion as well, and I'm thinking in terms here of problems to do with personal identity, where, so it seems to me, philosophers think that they can show in quick order that they're not identical to animals, and they then have to set up some very complicated metaphysical structures which are going to incorporate this picture, this claim. And in fact what they should do is step back and scrutinise the initial arguments much more thoroughly than they do. And just speaking personally, when I was a young academic in Oxford, I used to attend a lot of lectures by psychologists.
Right.
And what struck me was how careful about methodological questions psychologists were, how careful they were to interpret the implications of experiments. Okay. It was an era when psychologists were attending to that kind of thing very closely. And I had an enormously strong sense of the contrast between the methodological care that a discipline like psychology exhibited,
Yeah.
and what might be called a much more carefree, looser methodology that philosophers tend to adopt. And so I'm throughout my writings I've been trying to subvert some philosophical dogmas which seem to me inadequately supported.
So it seems that maybe you have two criticisms there. One is that a lot of people hold views that are unsubstantiated,
Yes.
but also that a lot of people hold radical, non-commonsensical ideas.
Yes.
So that those are both worries that you have, and I mean it seems that they can be distinguished, but you do
Yes.
get a lot of people holding wacky
Yes.
theories on kind of thin and unstable foundations.
I mean, I don't have an in-principle argument that the basic convictions that humans tend to have to be correct.
Right.
I don't think that. And certainly their understanding of all sorts of things around them is very incomplete. Very incomplete. It's much more a kind of a sense that the support that people have for what are often wacky views is kind of inadequate.
Right.
And insubstantial, and they don't stare at the evidence long enough and consider it. And I use the wacky views simply to illustrate where some of this kind of thinking gets you.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not that a conclusion which doesn't strike one as akin to common sense has to be ruled out.
So you mentioned personal identity
Yes.
as one kind of area in which this happens,
Yes.
and it's also one area that you've written
Yes.
extensively on. And I was wondering whether you could kind of talk about the areas of philosophy that have interested you and why they've interested you as much as they have.
Okay, throughout my career I've tried to be a non-specialist because philosophy is so interesting across the board, so I've tried to write about and think about a whole range of things. But looking back, one thing that has, one topic that has been central to me is what might be called personal identity, or the nature of persons. What kind of nature do we, as objects in the world, have? Okay, and putting it in a terminology which links up with the previous comment, what you find amongst philosophers who think about this is that they will look at a few cases which are kind of rather strange and not met with in the normal course of life, and about what happens in those cases they have certain intuitions.
So we're talking about amnesia and
Yes.
vegetative state patients.
Yes, we are. Yes, that's right.
Right.
Well, those are cases where they do actually happen.
Right.
But and people do have intuitions about them.
Yeah.
Or particularly, they have intuitions really about, might be called end-of-life scenarios.
Yeah.
And these intuitions are that the so-called person leaves the scene earlier than the animal organism. And therefore, if they have left the scene earlier than the organism, they have to be distinct things. They can't be the self-same thing. They can't both be there and not be there.
Right.
And so you get intuitions about these cases which lead you then to adopt a non-identity between the person and the animal.
But you've also been, I mean, I know from your work that you've been very interested in the thought experiments which fall outside reality, so things like brain transplantation, and you resisted that a lot.
Well, that has been a kind of a real difficulty, because undoubtedly the kind of intuitions that people tap into about brain transplants are intuitions which a lot of people share, and one shares them oneself from time to time.
Yeah.
Okay. But I have tried to argue that when you think about these cases more carefully, even there the grip of the intuitions can be weakened, and a more commonsensical, natural view of the person can be defended despite these tendencies.
It seems like you've got you're on the side of the underdogs in some of these, certainly with the personal identity debate, where
Yes.
the majority position is neo-Lockeanism, or
It
some
is,
kind of
yes.
psychological view. And
Well, when I mean, just making a historical remark, one of the reasons for being interested in personal identity was that there were some very creative and brilliant philosophers thinking about the problem. One was Parfit.
right,
Another was Shoemaker.
right,
Okay, and you are right. They were basically neo-Lockeans and made enormously imaginative efforts to expound it and defend it. And so it was very good philosophy. There were, as it were, people on the other side. One of whom was Bernard Williams,
yes,
who in his own way was incredibly brilliant, but was fighting a battle against neo-Lockeanism, which didn't seem to convince people. Someone else who was contributing as well was Wiggins,
yes, of course.
whose own thinking moved in the direction of bringing in the notion of an animal, which had been incredibly neglected in the neo-Lockean tradition.
Right.
Okay. And so it was a period when there was a lot of interesting philosophical work going on, and which gripped me, and I began to think there that although the way that Wiggins tried to bring the notion of the animal in didn't look to me to be completely persuasive, it was the right direction to go and to explore and to try and see how far it can be defended. And so that was again another research program which I've been thinking about ever since.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So again, subversive of a kind of a massively dominant intellectual tradition.
And it's gratifying to see that animalism is now gaining considerable more purchase on the scene, I think.
I love music, and I play the piano.
Oh, right.
And the thing I most like doing when I play the piano is accompanying other musicians, singers or instrumentalists. And I've had the fantastic good luck throughout my life to have bumped into and been allowed to accompany musicians who are far better musicians than I am, and from whom I've learned so much. So playing music is something I like doing. My wife sings and I accompany her.
That's amazing.
It is, and so it's a slightly old-fashioned kind of period around the piano. And listening to music in general,
Yeah.
actually, opera, chamber music,
Oh,
and so
fantastic.
on. I love reading. I also love, not exactly bird watching, but exercise and walking,
Yes.
and observing animals, though not perhaps, I wouldn't know what kind of animals they were.
Right.